Well, for Beezone listeners and watchers, this is Ed Reether in Boston area and Peter Malakoff in Mexico. And we are going to talk a little bit about Peter and all the work he has been doing over these many, many years. And so good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Eduardo.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. For the Beezone listeners, I've known Peter for many, many years. I believe it's close to 40, with a very a group of very close friends that we've all stayed connected to. And if anybody has come across your website, petermalakoff.com, they will have quite an experience about who you are. I know you in many different hats and over many different years, but your website identifies you as a religious studies scholar, Ayurvedic practitioner, storyteller, teacher, author, poet, woodworker, ghee maker, and nobody.
Yeah, I did all that.
Yeah. But when you go over your website and you look down the columns, you are not just a nobody. It is an amazing collection of philosophical essays, medical treatises, stories, videos, audios. You've lived in many different parts of this world. I believe you've recently moved to Mexico from India, where you lived for 10 years or more in Tiruvannamalai, outside of Ramana Maharshi's ashram.
And the Himalayas.
In the Himalayas, right. During the cooler, hot times, you went up north to the cool temperatures. And I met you in the Adida community in, I believe, 1982 or 1980. I think I went there in 1983. And yes.
Do you remember the incident that I think inspired our friendship? Was notes were sent down from Adida, and the notes basically where Adida was asking different people, do you feel my presence? And he asked the whole group. There was around 150 people in Mill Valley. And the notes are being read, and Adida wants to know how many people are feeling his presence. And everybody in the room raised their hand. And I didn't know what to do, but I stood up and I said, I got recognized, and I said, I think you all are either lying or deluded. And it caused a big uproar because, I was being adolescent, I was, whatever. People didn't like that. And Susan Lesser continued to read the notes after everybody kind of quieted down. And that was exactly what Adida had been saying in the rest of his message. And I mean, it didn't take a great genius to, in my opinion. So anyway, that's how we met.
In the Oddfellows Hall in Mill
That's
Valley?
Correct. That's correct. It was the Oddfellows Hall in Mill Valley. That's right.
Yeah, well, what you pointed to, which we could get into later, is really the conundrum of a lot of the spiritual practitioners or people who have some recognition of a spiritual transmitter, as Adida is. But also paradoxically here, you obviously have some relationship to Adida, because when I go to your site under the channel of home, you have a subsection called Death, Life, and My Great Teacher.
Oh, I'm not in any way putting down or criticizing Adida on that little story I told. Oh yeah, he was the jumping off place for my life. I had been a teacher of TM. Before that, I lived when I threatened to napalm a dog when I was a kid in protest to the war in Vietnam. I was never going to do it. The point was to make a point. And after that, I was kicked out of school. I was arrested, kicked out of school.
Where did you grow up? Where?
In Washington, D.C. area, a little vegetarian neighborhood called Tacoma Park, right on the outskirts.
Uh-huh.
And but anyway, that's where I started. I've lost the, where were we going with this?
I was just trying to get a little background on you. I want to tell you a little bit. What I know about you is that I believe you left your bedroom window at 15 years old after reading Hermann Hesse and Siddhartha.
That's correct.
At 15.
That's correct. And I just took off wandering. I mean, I just wandered the United States. I didn't know about sadhus and things like that at the time, but that's what I did. I kind of had a pack on my back and I just wandered the world.
And this was in 1970, 1969?
Dates are not going to work with me, Edward. I can remember all sorts of scriptural stuff, and with dates are just nothing. There's no correlation.
Well, let me just, we could jump in a hole because you are, to me, a real Renaissance man. I mean, the woodwork that you've done, the poetry you've written, the travels that you've been involved with. I mean, I could put you with Allen Ginsberg and the great woodworkers, and Hunter Thompson maybe would be fitting in there a little bit without the guns, and a few other wild Jack Kerouac stories to add to your.
When I read Siddhartha, I'd been kicked out of school, and I read it in one night. And toward around a little bit after midnight, I finished the book. And I put it down. I was sitting upstairs at our house. And all of a sudden, as if I had left my body and a hole had opened up in the ceiling. And a tremendous amount of just pure energy poured down upon me. And I had a vision. I had a vision of an old man coming out of a cave. And it seemed in India. He was wearing a dhoti. And he just looked at me and smiled. And I was just overwhelmed with bliss. But that was it. And after that, I was to leave home. It was years later I found out who that person was when I was at Shambhala bookstore in Berkeley, where they have all the books. I haven't been there in years, but they had all these books. And then up above the books on the walls, they had the pictures of all these saints. And I was walked into the bookstore, I was looking at the books, and I looked up, and there was this being, the exact one I had seen in this vision. And it was Ramana Maharshi.
Oh, wow.
And I just started crying. And it was so, it was this, I didn't think of that experience very often, but it was Ramana Maharshi. So I have some kind of connection there. And that occasioned me moving more and more into the Oriental, Hindu, Buddhist, Vedic tradition in terms of understanding my own life and my own feelings and what was going on and why I was not concerned with making a living like everybody else seemed to be around me. I was wandering the mountains.
And you became a TM teacher and went to, made you share a little bit about how you became a TM teacher in the early part of your spiritual quest.
So I was wandering the mountains of the United States. I would occasionally come down into the cities. I was in Isla Vista, California. Again, I don't know the dates. I know it was around 1970. And so, I was in a bookstore, a TM bookstore. And I was looking around, and an old man came up to me and he says, what are you doing? And he said, what are you doing with your life? And I trotted out the old answer I gave to people, I'm just flowing with the river of life. And he looked right at me and he says, yes, you're flowing with the river of life, but you can steer the boat and avoid many rocks and rapids on the way. And that completely changed the whole orientation of my life. Can you hear this? This is Mexico.
You're in Mexico. You could be in India.
You could be, but they don't have loudspeakers like this in the country. but they drive through the streets and they have like these, they're really loud. So anyway, he said that to me. It changed, I just had a whole different vision because I had been putting, I thought renunciation, leaving the world, this is the direction to take if one wanted to be happy. And he noticed I had a Bhagavad Gita with me, which I've been carrying around. And he said, are you familiar with Mahesh Yogi's commentary on the Gita, chapters 1 through 6? I said, no. And he says, Maharishi says that there's been a misinterpretation of renunciation. He saw me as, I was kind of like a renunciate type of character. And he says, a misinterpretation, he says, the typical approach is that renunciation leads to God realization. He said, Maharishi said that is absolutely backwards. It is God realization that leads to spontaneous renunciation, and which can look at, you can be living a very rich life, you could be having sex, it doesn't have anything to do with cutting yourself off from life. So that just totally blew me open, and that is why I decided to read Maharishi's Gita, and then I wanted to go join and become a teacher. But unfortunately, I never registered for the draft, and the FBI had been after me for years. So I couldn't get a passport to go to Europe. I had called Jerry Jarvis, who was with the TM movement, and, can I come, please? And he's, and he's like, well, I had to go call him maybe 5 times. He was in Europe with Maharishi, and I got through to him based on this guy giving me his number. Finally, he said, yeah, you can come. I just pestered him. I wanted to become a teacher. I wanted to meet Maharishi. And so he said, okay, but then I couldn't get a passport. And then because I just left, I never registered. And so what happened was that I was going to turn myself in, go to jail for a while, and then go become a teacher. But when I went to the offices, they wanted me to sign a confession or some kind of statement that I had not registered for the draft. And my brother's a lawyer, and I called him and I said, is this right? Something seems wrong. He says, don't sign it. He says, they don't have anything on you. And he says, and what it was, that my draft board, where I was supposedly registered, had been burned. People had broke in there and burned it. So by you could call it the grace of God, or whoever burned it, or whatever you want to call God, I got to go to Europe. I know that date. That was 1972. I went to Mallorca, Spain, and then to Fuji, Italy. While I was with Maharishi, you stopped me, and you told me not to tell too long stories.
Well, I wanted to just make a reference that you became a teacher within the TM organization. You became close to Maharishi, and that you were there for a number of years.
I was there. I wound up teaching. I gave the first back in America. I wanted to become a renunciate. Maharishi said, not in this lifetime. He says, your energy is already flowing upwards. He says, go out in the world, do some good. He also told me to get a degree in Vedic studies because I wanted to become a renunciate. And he says, not for you in this life. And so I wound up teaching, and I gave the first lectures on TM to the United States Army in Fort Meade, Maryland, and to the Strategic Air Command, people who fly the B-52 atomic bombers up in Loring Air Force Base in Maine. So I was really, I enjoyed teaching TM. I had a good time teaching TM. I thought I was doing a good thing teaching TM, and I still do. Yeah. And then, well, one day you're gonna like this. You're gonna like this. This is how I came. Howdy da. Okay, go ahead.
I don't want to.
I know I can hook you on that. It's sort of like. So one day somebody gave me the book, The Knee of Listening, and I was so turned off by the picture I didn't even read the book. About it on the cover. He gave me another book called The Method of the Siddhas. And I read that whole thing through, and that day, that night, I quit TM. And planned on coming out to California, and which I did. I packed up all my stuff, left, came out to the community in Northern California.
Well, I'm looking at, if I may, I'm going to just get off screen for a second. I'm going to ask you something.
Sure, sure.
So this cover here turned you off, and this one did not turn you off?
Yeah. Who would have thought it?
Who would have thought that?
Who would have thought it?
So listen, I want to jump because we can get into your story because you have many sub-stories within that meeting of Adida and standing up in Oddfellow Hall. And I want to go to some of the things that you really write about because this is one of the things we talked about. And one of the books that you have out there is called Reflections on Water, How Thoreau's Walden Pond mixed with the Ganges and yoga came to America with Swami Vivekananda, which is part of your scholarly work that you've done because you are a scholar in not only the Vedic tradition, but in many other traditions. But we recently had a discussion about Vivekananda because I recently moved to the Anasquam area, where I found out that Swami Vivekananda in his travels did not land up first in Chicago, although he did visit Chicago for a couple of weeks and tried to get into the World's Fair, which we will then talk a little bit about. But he actually came through Harvard and then into this area here and spoke. So this is how we reconnected a little bit on this topic. But the way you put this book together is fascinating because your poetry, your writing, your storytelling, and the format that you do, the flip book that you have, and also the PDF of this book, which I recommend people getting because the story that you tell is fascinating because you really go into depth in the full sense of the time, the period, the modernity, the new world, the electricity world, the transformative time that was, because you always see things, as I read you, in a context. You always see it in a time period. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about Yeats in the second coming of that poem, where the falconer has lost the falcon, all of that stuff, that's the depth that you have, which I think is just extraordinary and entertaining.
Well, thank you, Ed. I wish you would have said that years ago.
Well, here we are.
No, it's really nice.
No, really, it's really quite
I see analogies. I see analogies. I'm a comprehensivist. I had a scholarship with Bucky Fuller, who is known as the greatest comprehensivist of our day. But I see analogies, and I was very attracted to Henry David Thoreau. I knew his work very well. Particularly Walden is what the main work of his that attracted me, as well as his civil disobedience, being in jail for protesting the war, which my parents were very involved in that. We lived in the Washington, D.C. area. Give me just a second. Henry David Thoreau wrote when he was in the book Walden that I wrote it down, I lay down my book and go to my well for water, the well being Walden Pond. It was completely pure and clean at that time. And he said, there I meet the Brahmin who has come with his cup and, to get it, and our waters are mingled. And the pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred waters of the Ganges. Thoreau had brought only a few books with him for his 2-year, 2-month, 2-day retreat. That tells me he knew something about Tibetan Buddhism, although he never noticed it. They do 2-year, 2-month, 2-day retreats. And he spent that time in Emerson's cabin. He was a friend of Emerson, and it was Emerson who had loaned him the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the main books, one of the 2 books that he had with him. And in that book, Thoreau had talked about, you know, the mingling of the Ganges with the sacred Ganges, with the waters of Walden. And I was reading one day about the ice trade in New England, in which ponds, lakes, all over New England were harvested for their ice. And that ice was then shipped down to southern United States, Louisiana, into Mexico, into South America. And then one day, the big ice king, the Bill Gates ice king of his day, was this man called Frederick Tudor. And he was very wealthy, like Gates, not as much, but he was wealthy. And Tudor, who was shipping this ice, met with this guy called Samuel Austin, who was going back and forth out of Boston, out of India Wharf in Boston Harbor, with ships taking back, you know, spices, opium, silks, you know, all sorts of things from India to America. But on his return trip, they could carry nothing, you know, and they needed something, so they'd put rocks in the ship for ballast. You know, but there was nothing that India needed from the United States. It was a self-sufficient country. So he ran into Frederick Tudor, and he says, and they talked, and he said, I could bring ice to India. And Tudor was like, you know, if we could insulate it, and, you know, because it was a 4-month trip by schooner. So anyway, they agreed to do it. They shipped then, and what Thoreau saw, that developed into a business in which ice was sold to the East India Company in India. And that developed into a business. And one morning in Walden Pond, Thoreau looked out his window and he saw over 100 men out on Walden Pond cutting the ice into blocks. Walden was known for its high quality of ice and quality of the water. They looked around for really good ponds. And so that was how the waters of Walden were then mingled with the sacred waters of the Ganges, because Thoreau imagined that being in Calcutta, the water which was unloaded there, or in Chennai, Madras back then, and they would melt and it would run down into the river. And so he was talking not just of the mixing of the New England culture, Protestant, you know, Catholic, Christian culture with India, this ancient sacred culture. He was talking also literally.
Well, he would, if I'm not mistaken, in his own diaries, he talks about he would drink the waters of the Bhagavad Gita in the morning, and then he would drink the waters of Walden Pond. So the
Yes.
poetic licensing of this kind of what was actually happening, not only in Thoreau's mind and world, but in that period of time, because what you're now leading to is the arrival of a modern yogi, or Vivekananda, to the Chicago World's Fair in 1892.
Wait. You missed a really cool thing. Just a few miles upriver from where that ice was unloaded, it was unloaded on the Hooghly River, this particular ice, and which is the Ganges when it flows through Calcutta. And just was the Dakshineswar, which was the temple, Kali temple, where Sri Ramakrishna lived. And Sri Ramakrishna's primary devotee and lineage transmission holder, so to speak, using Tibetan terminology, was Swami Vivekananda. And it was Swami Vivekananda who then came to America in 1893. See, I know that date because I wrote the book. don't push me on too many dates. So, but that was when Vivekananda in 1893 came to America. Now, Vivekananda, who, by the way, Adida said that he is a incarnation. His incarnation body was a combination of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. I didn't write about this in the book, but I knew about it. And but those two together, and they were uniquely joined together because at the end of his life, Ramakrishna had given everything. He said to Vivekananda, I am just a poor fakir, Fakir, a poor, I've given you everything, that transmission that he gave. And Vivekananda was a unique combination of, I don't know how that stuff works. I mean, it's kind of interesting, cool to hear about it, but I don't know how it works. But it was a unique combination that has happened before in the great tradition of religion and spirituality, but it's extraordinarily rare. And that was who Vivekananda was. And Vivekananda traveled all around India. He didn't know what to do with the gift he had been given. He had been made the head of what's now today the Ramakrishna Vivekananda order. All the monks had to listen to him. Ramakrishna had them, and all the monks wanted to become monastics. They didn't want to, but Vivekananda, after wandering through northern and southern India, going up into the Himalayas, going down to the tip, Cape Comorin, came to the conclusion that in India, what was needed was not religious teachings. He came to the conclusion that what was needed in India was food, medical care, things like that. And he turned the Ramakrishna Vivekananda order into a very much a service organization, still composed of monks, not that they had nothing to do with religion, but that religion was in India oriented towards the service of the people, of the poor, predominantly. Now, and he had a lot of kickback from the monks because they were like, dude, this is not what we want to do. The world is mud. The world is crap. We don't want to go out into the world. And but Vivekananda, Ramakrishna put me in charge. This is what I'm telling you to do.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Vivekananda went down to the tip of India, had traveled all over India, was at his wit's end, if you will, and decided that this was where, because it was in the world of his devotees or people around him, that there was this world parliament of religions going to go on in Chicago, and he was asked to go and represent India, bring the wisdom. His mission was to bring the wisdom of India to America and bring back the wealth, if you will,
the technological wealth and money. And he was put up to that. He didn't come up with that idea on his own. It was a Raja,
right?
A very wealthy, old Indian king, you could just say, who said, you're wasting your time. A great light like you to talk to the Indians. It was not so popular. They didn't want to hear about Advaita Vedanta. It was not appropriate. They had other things that were important. And so his first mission, he thought he would go to America, bring the great wisdom of the East to America, and that he could, that people would then want to share their technology and their money to help elevate the poor of India. And it was that Raja who paid for his trip. He took a steamer from India to Japan and then to Vancouver and then a train across to the East Coast, to Chicago and places. So
he did get to the World's Fair, and when he spoke, that was a very extremely transformative moment in religious and spiritual history of the United States. That moment that he stood up in the midst of all of these religious leaders from all over the world. And this.
See what happened. This was it was a moment. I compare it in my own mind and understanding, although I didn't pay much attention to the Beatles. I compare it to the Beatles. It was transformative. There were thousands of people that would show up to see Vivekananda wherever he went in America after he gave his initial talk in Chicago at the Chicago World's Fair, which is where Tesla and Westinghouse for the first time powered the whole place with electricity, where Ferris built his first Ferris wheel that carried 2,000 people at a time, where the largest building in the world, the manufacturer's building, had been built, which had a city inside of it. It was like an incredible time. There was a moving electric sidewalk, wooden sidewalk. The boats would come in from Chicago and people would stand on the sidewalk. It was all, and the whole place was lit with electricity and lights, and there were elevators, and the whole thing was powered. This was, Tesla saw the transformation of the whole world through this electricity. And they had also, for the Christian organization, said, well, we're going to put up a world parliament of religions as part of this World's Fair of 1893 in Chicago. And we're going to be able to show the wonder and the supremacy of Christianity. And so for the first time in history since Akbar, who also gathered together all the religions of India in his time and brought people together, all the religions of the world were gathered together in the same room for the first time in history. Of course, that reminds you of the three Christs of Ypsilanti that Adida used to talk about, that in 1959, I gotta tell this because people should hear this.
Go ahead, this is your time.
In 1959 in Ypsilanti, Michigan, in an insane asylum there, run by a Jewish psychiatrist called Milton Rokich, 3 people were committed to his institution, each of whom thought he was Jesus Christ. So he had them all put in a room together, and he wrote a book about what happened. And you know, this guy's a traitor, this guy's false, this guy's false, I'm Jesus Christ. So that there's much more than that just happened, but that was the initial. And so like that, you have 3 people, each of whom thinks he's Jesus Christ, put together in the same room. For the first time in history, in the 1893 World's Fair at the World Parliament of Religions, all the religions of the world were gathered together in the same room. It wasn't like overt, yours is better than mine, but each person who rose to address the group said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I represent Buddhism, ladies and gentlemen, I represent Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. When Vivekananda stood up, he stood up on the afternoon of the first day, after praying to the goddess that his speech would be sweet and beneficial, and that she would fill him. He stood up, and he was a noble looking character, exquisite English, incredible bearing, handsome, dressed in robes and a turban. And he stood up and he said, brothers and sisters of America. And the whole group of 7,000 people rose to their feet and gave him an applause that lasted almost 10 minutes, just on that. And with that, the spark of, to me, of Vedic tradition, of the, whatever it represents, of the Guru Yoga, of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, of the Bhagavad Gita, the spark of that jumped to America in that moment.
Well, when you say this is where the poetry really does resonate with the reality, the spark, the electricity, the technology, the moment, the electricity that was in the air, and he was said by the people who met him, he was like 1,000 suns. He shone so brightly. It was all about this electricity that he transmitted, that what he got from Ramakrishna, if you will, want to be poetic about it all. It was a moment of great significance, as much as, you know, the splitting of the atom or the 1905 paper by Einstein.
And it's out of that spark that you see the development, you know, he brought the yoga of God realization to America, not Hatha yoga. They didn't put down Hatha yoga, although Ramakrishna used to say, you know, he used to poo-poo it because he said, you know, I mean, there were, first of all, what do they mean by Hatha yoga? There were people who attempted to attain God by Hatha yoga. They were not just people who did exercise, you know, a couple times a week or daily. So they used a lot of, one of the definitions in Sanskrit of Hatha is force. And inevitably they would become angry. Ramakrishna talked about that. They would become angry because they, you know, trying to force their way through will, through and physical application in their own body of force to crash the gates of heaven. And they were known humorously, like they become angry. And you can see this if you look at a great practitioner of Hatha yoga, who took it very seriously. They will become extraordinarily stern, and one could say angry. So they didn't put down Hatha Yoga, but that's not what the yoga that Vivekananda brought to the West. What he brought, he called practical Vedanta. He said it was that the wisdom of the Vedas free from all Hinduism. That was not what he was bringing. He wasn't bringing Hinduism. He was bringing principles of life, science of life. This is what Maharishi later took in the science of creative intelligence, you know, or I'm not saying he took it from Vivekananda, but he duplicated that. Trying to take TM out of the realm of religion. In other words, it didn't matter what you believed in. Who cares what people believe in? It's irrelevant.
Well, this is the biggest difference between Eastern and Western. We understand it in the West, religion, which is in this belief system.
Yes. So when Vivekananda toured the United States, he was sold out everywhere he went. Everywhere. I mean, he was really sold out. You know, thousands of people would come to see him. And on several occasions, he just left the hall in the middle of the talk. And he later commented, why'd you do that? You know, you had all these people that had come to see you, you know, and you just left. He says, I felt I was having too much power. Too much was being projected onto me. And people needed to think for themselves and to feel for themselves on the basis of that consideration of thinking. Okay, I told enough of a story.
Well, which then now I want to jump a little bit, because what we're talking about is the ancient wisdom of the East, bringing in the person of Vivekananda, but also the Vedic scriptures that went along with the depth of where Vivekananda was coming from. And so I want to leap a little bit forward, because part of what your latest book is
Hanuman story for Ram Dass.
A Hanuman story for Ram Dass, which I'm going to jump into where we met one another with Ram Dass, who was with our culture in the late 60s and the 70s, where you met him, because now you're well steeped in the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the stories of India. I mean, you could tell stories that will entrance. I have been in a room where you have transformed people in your ability to be a storyteller, a bard in the Irish tradition, somebody who can just relate a story and people will be entranced. And I got to give it to you. You got the gift of whatever gab it is, you know.
Thank you, Ed. That's
no, it's true.
I should have said it years ago, but still, I appreciate it.
No. But this book here, which is also parallel to what it is that we're speaking about, is Hanuman. The devotee, the guru, the devotee relationship, the relationship to this wisdom, the three Christs. They're all saying it's me, but in India they're saying yes, it's you and everybody else. This is your nature, right?
Yes. So how did I get from there to there? You talked about water, living water. And in the book, how Thoreau, Walden Pond, how Thoreau mixed with the Ganges and yoga came to America, the subtitle is Reflections on Water. And I'm going to get to I just need a step back and then I'll get to it. In the last part of that book, the Walden book, there's a story of Eknath. Did you read that?
Yes.
Okay. There's something called the Kashi Yatra. Kashi is Banaras. And it's Kashi Yatra, or the pilgrimage, or the Yatra, holy pilgrimage, sacred pilgrimage of the Kashi Yatra, is when people take water from the Ganges in Banaras. And then they used to walk 1,500 miles to the south tip of India. They used to walk 1,500 miles, and they would pour that water into the ocean there. And then they would take some of that water and they would walk 1,500 miles back to North India and pour that water over a lingam that was a holy lingam sacred to Shiva and, of course, and to Rama. Because Rama actually made, I don't want to go into that story, but Rama actually made his own lingam there, and Rameshwaram it's called. There's two, used to be two lingams there. So Eknath, which was a great saint of India, was taking this water from Benares all the way down barefoot, along with a group of other people, to pour into the ocean at Rameshwaram, where Rama made a lingam before he crossed to Lanka to engage in the war with Ravana. And they were almost there, and their last part walks across a lot of deserty type sand. And everybody was super thirsty, and they came across a dying donkey. And the donkey was laid out, it was completely dehydrated. And Eknath, carrying this holy water to be poured over the sacred lingam in Ganges water, gave that water to the donkey. And everybody's like, what the hell are you doing? This is like, we're on this yatra, we're doing this sacred trip, and you were bringing water all the way from Benares, the holy land of Shiva, all the way to the south. And what the heck are you doing pouring this water in the donkey's mouth? And Eknath talked about holy water, living water. That was the sacred thing of the Vedas. That was the sacred thing in life. This water, not what form it takes, but whether it is used to serve life itself. And so you say, it's that living water that is at the essence of the religious tradition of the Vedas. And it's that living water that the gurus bring into the tradition. It's the living waters that Jesus gave to the woman at the well. It's always the living waters of life that refresh the tradition. And wait, and then I'm done. And I wrote this down because it was the one thing I wrote down I wanted you to hear. And this is from Adida. He says, and if any generation is without living masters, then its children are without light, even if holy books are piled up one upon another like a fortress in the night. So that's the living water. And how does that relate to Hanuman's story for Ram Dass? Yeah, now watch this hand, now watch this hand, now watch. Okay, okay. So how does that, because in the person of Neem Karoli Baba, who was the guru of Ram Dass, he was a living Siddha master. And he was the one who, through Ram Dass, popularized most of the Ramayana and the story of the Ramayana in the West. And the Ramayana, in the Tulsidas version, is mainly a story of see how flimsy my attention is, and I see you turn your head and I just go, whoa. So Tulsidas, so I'm relating how this all relates to the Hanuman story for Ram Dass. The Tulsidas Ramayana, Tulsidas created that Ramayana for the modern times because he felt that all the old ancient practices of meditation, of Hatha Yoga, of all those practices did not work in the Kali Yuga, which is the age or the time in which we are, and that only bhakti worked in our day and age as a spiritual practice. And that bhakti was what you saw around Neem Karoli Baba, what I saw around Neem Karoli Baba. They said that there was 8 limbs of yoga in the Ashtanga yoga system. Around Neem Karoli Baba, he said The saying was there's only 5 limbs, eating, drinking, sleeping, walking around, and having tea. These were the 5 limbs. They were describing the Guru Yoga, the Ishta Guru Bhakti Yoga, which is the yoga that was practiced also by Hanuman. Hanuman didn't do any spiritual technique or method. He was in love with Rama. He had given his life completely to Rama. And for me, I use all the different spiritual Ramayanas. But for me, that was the essence of the Tulsidas Ramayana, which was the one that was popularized by Neem Karoli Baba and brought to America by Ram Dass.
And so just to bring the Christian idea of the living water to the conversation, which is about baptism. It's about a spiritual transmission that you're referring to. You can tell it in a story through all sorts of ways, but it really is, the connection is through some form that you stood up in Oddfellows Hall, and ironic, and Adida also says in a lot of ways, without that transmission, without that spiritual connection, without that recognition, or you might say baptism, and I don't mean it in necessarily a Shakti Samadhi, but a feeling relationship that goes beyond the 5 senses, this feeling sense that you are connected to some greater force than your own self.
A persistent, overwhelming sense of that, not just a momentary experience of that. It is like every one of us has had something that we're addicted to, and usually we indulge it. And when you've indulged it to the point and explored it to the point where you can't take it any further, and it still is not what you hoped it would be while you first went into it, because it was completely enchanting and it was promised something. Are we through with it? And this hearing, what you call this spirit baptism, is like that with all of life. But a lot of people are not ready for it. Shankara, the great teacher of Advaita, used to use the term Adi Karbeda in his Brahma Sutras, which is the Bible of Advaita Vedanta. And that's my term, so Westerners can relate to it. What is taught there? I lived right next to you visited me in India. I lived very near to the Ramana Maharshi ashram. And I had that experience with him. And Ramana Maharshi used to teach inquiry, vichara. Who am I? People would come to him, this, that, who's asking this question? Find out that. One day the Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram, this is the Shankara set up 4 mosques, 4 main temples in the 4 corners of India. And the Shankara of Kanchipuram came to Ramana Maharshi, and they were Danda Swamis. They had staff. You never put the staff on the ground. It always rests on little pads. There's pad carriers. But anyway, they came to visit and pay their respects to Ramana Maharshi, an enlightened sage. And while they were sitting there, the Shankaracharya, with I think it was 3 or 4 other guys who were in the Shankaracharya order, a woman, an older woman, came into the presence, threw herself and started wailing, and Bhagwan, Bhagwan, give me some upaya, give me something to do, give me some practice. Please, tell me what to do, give me some instruction. And Ramana, as typical, it was kind of rude, but she was desperate because the Shankaracharya was there and all that. And Ramana says, who is it that is asking this question? This is classical Advaita. Find out that, one way. And the Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram said, you gave her vichara, inquiry. Ramana said, yes. And he says, she's not qualified for vichara. And qualified not like because she's a woman or because she's old, or she doesn't have the qualifications he could just see. And Rama said, yes, she's not. He said, then why did you tell her that, to do this inquiry? And Rama said, I had to give her something. That's what's happened without the concept of adhikarbheda. That you have to be qualified for these practices. People read Advaita Vedanta and go, this is like incredible. Adida used to call this the talking school of Advaita Vedanta. And they try to convince themselves of the argument of, there's only God, or there's nothing but oneness, or whatever it is. But it's Maharishi also used to talk to, he used to call it mood making a mood about it and creating that. But there's lacking in qualification. And the inquiry and the spiritual practices, all of which I believe, this is just beliefs for what it's worth, but I believe were true and are true, but one has to be qualified for them. And without that qualification, Shankara called them afala, fruitless, without fruit.
Well, this is where the term, you really have to be ripe to receive. You have to have gone through some form, if you will, of purification. You have gone through some practices, have gone through the listening, hearing phase, or whatever the practices are. Otherwise, you are a believer, and that's fine, and you are a rudimentary devotee or a practitioner or a religious person. But these are really rare kinds of qualifications that you're speaking about. This is something about the traditions have always said, that for the most part, this is, although the revelation is for everyone, there is a hierarchy, and this is a taboo subject in an American democratic homogenous kind of world, but there is a hierarchy in the spiritual sense that not everybody is qualified for the ripeness of receiving the darshan of nirvikalpa samadhi, whatever the higher realization of what we're speaking about.
And it doesn't necessarily have to occur or have occurred in this lifetime.
Right.
Ramana Maharshi being a great example of that. He said it was through his own practice over many lifetimes and in past lifetimes.
Yeah, the point is being that you're on the path. That's the point.
But you see, the grace, kripa, which means grace in Sanskrit, the grace of the Guru Kripa, all bets are off, no qualifications.
Oh, yeah.
So that also, not instead of, but that also is true.
Right.
That also is true.
Yeah, all bets. Nobody has there's no pre-qualification in the full sense of this term, because we're speaking paradoxically. I mean, it's not a preparatory kind of thing, but yet there is a seemingly a stages that go along with it. But there is the grace and there is the transcendence of all of this, because this is a dream place and all of that other stuff. But yeah, there's no pre-qualification.
Well, just to give an example, one of the qualifications that Shankara gives of a person who can have a fruitful vichara inquiry is that they never lose consciousness in deep sleep. Just ask yourself that. It's a profound state of consciousness, which is actually a duality, because now for the first time, there's self and other. Otherwise, most of us live in a unity of ignorance. But when there's self, which remains separate, different from, for the first time you have duality. Then the talk of unity, Advaita, becomes meaningful because there's duality. That duality, Shankara was saying, is ultimately false. There's not Atman and the world. That's yoga system. Patanjali Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, is based on Purusha and Prakriti, the self and the world. It's a dualistic system. It's one of the 6 classical systems of Indian philosophy. But there's also Advaita, and Advaita says, you guys are full of it. I mean, it's not like that's a low attainment, but they're saying that's not the ultimate state of reality. So that's just an example. I can wander off, so I'm trying to behave myself here, Ed.
That's all right. It's good to wander a little bit because we have a subject that has no boundaries to it, and it's open to all sorts of inclusions and stories that go along with it. But I want to focus a little bit on your work now that you're doing in the Ayurvedic tradition that you've focused in on. So you're doing work in quote unquote a medical profession, or Ayurveda is a health profession. It's a rebalancing. I'm not gonna try to tell you
it's
what
the Vedic tradition in regards to health and disease and the elemental makeup of everything. Everything. So in Ayurveda, there's what they call Vaidyas and Vishaks. Vishaks they apply Ayurveda. People who do the massage, the purification techniques, things like that for other people. Wait a minute.
No, but I'm gonna have to hear. So okay. I have the hook. I've got you hooked.
Okay.
I hope I have the audience hooked because I'm looking at the time. I do know my attention span audience is about this moment. We've been at here recording for close to 1 hour, and we could go on for another hour easily. But with the hook that I just gave you, I want to discuss with you the work that you're doing in the Ayurvedic world in the next time we get together, which I hope is sooner than later. What do you say?
Sure. I mean, you know, I'm like, I'm honored. I love being asked. I'm like a cow that wants to be milked. I mean, I used to take care of cows. You know, they do want to be milked. You know, like it swells up in them. I've been given so much, and it becomes a burden if one does not share it.
Yeah.
You know, of course, a lot of people don't want to hear it. You know, plain simple.
Well, they can always tune out. I mean, this is a free open channel we have here. You can click, get out of here anytime you want. Nobody's holding you in this terrible place if you're not enjoying it. So feel free to drop out anytime you want. But I found
how much time do we have? What time is it?
I want to not continue. This is what I'm saying. I don't want to continue now because the time is getting close to 1 hour, and I do know that's about the limit of my audience. So if you will accept my invitation for another dialogue, another talk, another session with me and the Beezone, I would love to have another time with you sooner than later.
Absolutely. You have to say please, but I'll do it.
Please.
Good. No, I'd love to, Ed. Thank you.
Not too proud to say please.
not too humble to ask for it. Well, there's an Arab saying, it says, it's good to know the truth and speak it, but it's better to know the truth and speak of palm trees. So I never forget that when I write.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. And I'm sure and I hope that the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. You're a rich and talented and scholarly person with lots of varying degrees of study and accomplishment. So I want to continue the discussion with you, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Till the next time.
Done.